Hi everyone, welcome to your JenTalk on privilege, or social privilege rather. I'm Jennifer Kalfsbeck-Getz, and I'm here to talk to you about this very important sociological concept. So let's first talk about how we react when we first begin to hear about this concept of privilege or social privilege. If someone says to us, you're privileged, or you benefit from white privilege, or male privilege, or fill in the blank, how do we react to something like that? Just think about it if you're receiving that kind of comment. How do you react? Defensively? With anger? We deny it? The denial of privilege or social privilege actually perpetuates the inequality that it represents. So we need to talk about the importance of what privilege really is so that we can understand if we do in fact benefit from it, understand what that really means and that it's not necessarily an accusation, and know what we can do to perpetuate equality among groups. So let's first talk about what privilege really is. Privilege exists when one group has something of value that another group does not have because of their group membership. It can be basic necessities like food, shelter, clothing, and oftentimes it's more than that. Access to jobs with a living wage, access to opportunities within work, within school, like promotions, or elevated classes, or one-on-one time with teachers, access to appropriate and relevant health care at the time in which we need it, not only emergency health care. The list goes on and on. Access to things that we consider to be important, necessary, and valued so that we can achieve all of our goals and dreams within our lives. The greater access you have to those things, the more privilege you have. Let me give you an example. If people listen to what I'm saying in this presentation right now, or at a meeting at work, and my Latina counterpart who does a similar presentation or speaks about this topic at work is not listened to the same degree as I am, how much of that is attributed to the white privilege that I experience every day that I don't really have to think about? If a person of color speaks on the concept of privilege, in the back of many people's minds it is, well, yeah, they're talking about it because they're a minority, so they're biased. People without certain types of privilege that we'll talk about later are more likely to be questioned when they actually talk about those concepts. Therefore, people with privilege are more likely to be listened to, even on topics of privilege like this. We're usually unaware of our privilege. That's key, and that's going to be the most important thread throughout the rest of this presentation today, is that we're blind to our privilege. Privilege is invisible. Therein lies the power of privilege and the reason why we deny it or we don't initially see it. I'm white, and I certainly go through life with the benefits of being white in the United States, maybe more than any other status that one can have within the United States at this point in time in history. There's no way that I recognize all of the things I can do because people don't even question me because of the color of my skin and my perceived ethnicity. That's power. Privilege is something that's really very invisible. Let's talk more about that. When we notice differences, it can lead to differential treatment, even if the differential treatment is unintended or if it's intended to have the opposite effect. Passing is a coping mechanism. If someone's ever had to try to pass in a context so that people didn't know their unprivileged status, they understand the power that privilege has, and they're seeking that invisibility as well so that they can just pass through contexts or settings. It's more difficult to pass as a male if you're female. It is more difficult for some to pass as white if you're an ethnic minority, but not completely. There are many who can pass as white or engage in behaviors, language characteristics, etc., that allow them to pass more as white. And then, of course, be accused by members of their own ethnicity of selling out. So it's a double-edged sword. It is easier to pass as someone who's able-bodied, even if you have a disability. And many people do that because the privilege that is invisible of being able-bodied is a critical thing in our culture. You can pass as being a different religion, and many many people of different religious backgrounds have passed or even changed their religions so that they could be members of the dominant religion to escape any kind of persecution. So passing is critical. It happens a lot, especially for people who have disabilities, like learning disabilities, where it's something that they can cope with. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact on their lives, but if people knew, they may not have the same opportunities that they have otherwise. Seeking the invisibility of the privileged is really what we're trying to do when we're passing. Wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to pass and we were able to embrace all of our differences in the multicultural world we're in? And yet the world that we're in means that some are privileged, which means they have greater access to resources than others. When we're privileged, we can go about our daily lives without wondering how others will respond to our statuses or notice our differences. So imagine in the United States, if you're white, male, middle class or higher, maybe even working class, depending on the community that you live in, able-bodied, over the age of 18 and under the age of 60, you have a great deal of privilege. Add to that being heterosexual, and you probably score 100 out of 100 on most privilege checklists, which we'll talk about later. Most of us don't have all of those qualities, but many do. Those who have all of the qualities that I just described are most likely to be defensive and uncomfortable with this concept of privilege because they know they too have had to overcome challenges, and most people do, especially the finest people in our lives have to overcome challenges in order to be successful. Maybe that same white male that I just described has served in the military and saved people and their lives and had to make really difficult life and death decisions. It feels unfair to someone with that kind of privilege to suggest that they don't encounter challenge. And the concept of privilege is not suggesting that they don't. It's suggesting, as we talk here, that they have not encountered challenges because of their status in society based on ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, ability, age, religion, etc. Examples of privilege in daily life are as follows. White people can assume that race won't be used to predict whether they will fit in at a school or work. While we know that people who are of a dominant cultural race in the United States as white, they're more likely to be successful at school or work, either in their classes or getting promotions or moving up the ladder. We don't think about it when we're hiring them. We don't wonder, are they going to fit in here? We think about it when we have someone who is very different. Maybe they have an accent. Maybe they look very different, and we can see in the interview that they have some cultural values that are different from those within the workplace. We would not ask ourselves if a white person would fit in, but we do ask if those folks would fit in. Men can reasonably expect that if they work hard and play by the rules, they'll get what they deserve and feel justified in complaining if they don't. There's two key pieces there. When we have privilege, we believe that if we just do what we're supposed to do, the spoils of our riches will come our way. And if they don't, we're justified in complaining. But when people don't have privilege, they're not confident that if they play by the rules, that they'll get what they deserve. In fact, oftentimes they feel like they have to play by the rules and do extra work to prove themselves, to get what others would get without having to do the extra. And they may be reluctant to complain because people could say that it's because they're women or because they're people of color or because they're disabled that they're complaining. Men and white people don't have to worry about that. Heterosexuals can move about in public without fear of being harassed or attacked because of their sexual orientation. For those of us who are not gay, we don't worry on a day-to-day basis if we hold the hand of our partner, sit on their lap, kiss them on the cheek, show affection and show love in public, that others will have a problem with it. Anyone who is gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and shows affection to someone other than who is perceived to be the opposite sex is always looking over their shoulder to see if other people will be uncomfortable, give them a hard time about it, and remind them that they're not okay or not quote unquote normal. It's not the kind of thing that those of us who are heterosexual have to worry about. Again, it's invisible. We're blind to it. We can go through life not even thinking twice about what we do in terms of our affection or affiliation with our significant others in public. People who do not have disabilities can succeed without people being surprised because of low expectations of their ability to contribute to society. So I don't have any disabilities that I know of anyway. I have had injuries in the past that have been surgically repaired, but I have not lived my life as someone with a disability. So people don't question my ability to be successful. I have an employee who is essentially legally blind and visually impaired. He can only see some peripheral vision. People are regularly surprised when he is successful at certain tasks because he is blind. It's something that I don't ever have to worry about, and on a day-to-day basis, people comment to him about their surprise that he can be so successful. Christian people in the United States do not lie about their religion in self-defense. I'm sure that there are some exceptions to that, but generally speaking, if you're of a Christian faith, you do not fear persecution throughout the United States for admitting that you celebrate Christmas or talking about going to church or walking to church, etc. It's something that's expected. It's a norm. It's not that everyone does do it, but no one thinks less of people who are engaged in Christian religious activities. Other religions oftentimes are not open, or members of those religions are not open about their activities with their mosque, with temple, or with other religious activities because they feel that they are likely to be persecuted and they still want the same opportunities with school, work, etc. throughout the community. People with financial stability have never gone to bed hungry. It seems like such a base comment, and yet it's so critical. For those of us who have never experienced poverty, extreme poverty, we can go through life knowing that at the end of the day, we're going to have food. Even if we were to lose our home in foreclosure and we had family to live with, those of us who have that privilege have never actually gone to bed wondering, will I have enough food to eat tomorrow? Will I have enough food for my children tomorrow? It is a type of privilege that we don't even have to think twice about having this most basic necessity. And yet there are people in our lives who do go to bed hungry every day or who do not have enough food to feed their children, even in the United States, especially in some of our urbanmost and ruralmost areas. Those folks do not experience the same privilege that those of us do who have enough food for ourselves and our families. And when we do have that privilege, we don't even really think about it. It's just something we take for granted. That's that key aspect of privilege we've been talking about. Consequences of privilege. So what are the consequences for those who are privileged? They're unable to realize how others are affected by their lack of privilege. It robs us the opportunity to empathize when people don't have that invisible opportunity or power. Let's talk about the consequences for those lacking privilege. And before we do that, let's talk about one more consequence of those who are privileged. Those who have those different statuses of privilege. And again, many of us have some of those. Few of us have all of them. But for those of us who have those statuses of privilege, we certainly have friends, family members, loved ones, colleagues, coworkers, classmates who do not have that same level of privilege. Having the ability to empathize, work with, and understand those who are experiencing a lack of privilege can be critical in our day-to-day lives with our families, with work, and at school. As well, if you marry someone who is of a lesser privileged status or share a home with someone, you would look for them to be able to carry their weight, and yet someone with less privilege is less likely to have opportunities to get jobs, keep jobs, attend higher education, get the appropriate health care, etc. So we may not be directly affected, but we may very well be, and probably are, indirectly affected by the fact that people in our lives who we count on for work, for family, etc., do not maintain all the privileged statuses. And when they're negatively impacted, we're negatively impacted too, even if we don't see it immediately in our own paychecks or our own day-to-day experiences. Okay, now let's talk about the consequences for those lacking privilege. Limited life chances. We've talked about life chances in JenTalks before. Life chances are those relate to our access to resources that we need or that we find beneficial. So you can see as we first started talking about privilege, the more privileged you are, the more likely you have elevated or higher life chances. And your life chances can change throughout your life. For example, when I was born to a family that had very little money, probably at or below the poverty line. I was born a white female. My parents had never been to college. So I certainly had the privilege of being white and had the privilege of an intact family with two parents and grandparents that could help support me. But the likelihood that I was going to go to college, obtain a job with a college degree, or earn a wage in the six figures area, which at the time seemed astronomical, but today is not out of question at all, was highly unlikely. I was likely to be, at best, a lower level nurse, maybe a teacher, maybe work in retail or in the restaurant industry. Something like that was a predictor based on my life chances at the time that I was born. There's nothing wrong with any of those opportunities, but we all know that those opportunities mean that it'll be harder for me to make ends meet, harder for me to purchase a home, harder for me to get loans, etc. Even harder for me these days to get access to appropriate health care for myself and my family and my children. Obviously, my life changes changed throughout my life as I earned degrees, was able to earn more in my workplace in terms of income, and that affected the life chances of my daughter. When she was born, circumstances were a little bit different from her than they were for me because of the different privileged statuses, including one of socioeconomic status. But life chances really are, at any given point in time, what are the chances that you will have the opportunity to achieve or obtain not only things that you need, but things that are desirable for you to even get ahead? When we are more privileged, we have heightened life chances, and when we are less privileged, our life chances are limited. The consequences of privilege can lead to prejudices when we can't empathize with how someone is experiencing the life around them because they have to work harder to prove themselves. For example, we tend to think that maybe they've got a chip on their shoulder. Maybe they're just not as capable. Maybe culturally they've learned some bad behaviors and that's why they can't function. And so we're prejudiced against those groups, and we might even discriminate. Those isms that we talk about, racism, classism, sexism, and homophobia, all stem from these kinds of prejudices. And as we discriminate, even unintentionally, maybe because we think someone won't fit in when we interview them for a job, we're concerned that they won't be successful in school or at work because they're in a wheelchair or visually impaired, we perpetuate their limited life chances. So finally, let's recap what we've talked about with privilege. Privilege gives advantages to people without us even knowing it. Privilege is typically invisible. Privilege negatively affects the lives of communities because it gives groups an elevated status over others. And oftentimes, it's unintended. How can we counteract privilege? Be conscious of privilege. Think about it. Know that you have a privileged status or recognize when others may not, and take it into account when you're making decisions or drawing conclusions and making assumptions. Support people who are without privileges and roles that can change perceptions of groups so that we can dismantle the social privilege. It's not so that other people are more disadvantaged, but so that everyone is equally advantaged. You can check your privilege and your biases. Check your level of privilege in the United States. There's a checklist on privilege at this site here. If you receive this PowerPoint presentation through the email, you can also just click on checklist your privilege. But through BuzzFeed, they've promoted a sociologically supported privilege checklist that will give you a sense for where you are on the privilege hierarchy here in the United States. I can tell you I scored a 64 out of 100, which was pretty highly privileged with some exceptions. But generally, I go through life relatively privileged because of my statuses of being white, able-bodied, of a middle age, although I'd like to be younger, as many people would say, etc. Also, you can access your biases and gain an understanding of where your biases are. We have hidden biases that we don't even realize we have. This one's a little harder to accept oftentimes because many of us try not to be biased. And yet, when given the opportunity to really dig into our subconscious, we find that we're more biased than we would have thought. You can just go ahead and Google Harvard's Project Implicit, or you can type in the URL that I've listed here.